Susan Sullivan's 60th birthday had been taking over the house all week. By the time that morning came, the plans were already moving from room to room like a storm I was expected to clean up around. I heard her on the phone talking about the private room at an upscale place in Alexandria, the floral arrangement for the front table, the cake, the seating, and which relatives from Fairfax and Arlington mattered enough to place near her. Brian moved through the house with that restless energy he always had when his mother was preparing to be admired. He kept checking his phone, asking whether the event manager had confirmed the timing, whether the flowers had arrived, whether the cousins from out of town had replied yet. I heard every bit of it. I saw every bit of it. What I did not hear not once was anyone asking what I was wearing when we were leaving or whether I was even going. I told myself they were busy. I told myself someone would mention it once the rush settled down. That morning I got up at 5:30 like I always did, made breakfast, started the laundry, wiped down the counters and cleaned the kitchen before the sun was fully up. Susan passed by me on her way to her room and said only one thing. Make sure the house is really clean today. That was it. Not a word about her birthday dinner that evening. Brian ate, grabbed his keys and left for work without looking at me long enough to explain anything. All day, I kept trying to quiet the tight feeling in my chest, that low sharp feeling that tells you something is wrong before you are ready to admit it. Late that afternoon I opened the closet to put away clean towels and stopped cold. Brian's best suit was gone. So were the polished dress shoes I had seen by the door the night before. I texted him right away and asked if he was going somewhere that night. His reply came back almost instantly. Stay home. I read those two words over and over until they stopped looking like language and started feeling like a verdict. Around 7 that night, the house in Alexandria had gone unnaturally quiet. I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of instant noodles growing cold while my husband and mother-in-law were across town at Susan's birthday dinner without me. Then my phone rang. It was Brian. I picked up and before I could say hello, he said in that clipped, irritated tone I knew too well, "Bring your card to the venue right now. We are short $3,500 on the balance." That was the moment it stopped being a suspicion and became something uglier. They had not forgotten me. They had left me home on purpose, and the second they needed money they remembered exactly where to find me. I did not throw the phone. I did not scream. I just sat there in that dim kitchen with his words still in my ear, and my mind did something stranger than panic. It went backward. It went back 8 years to before Susan Sullivan ever lived under my roof, before Brian learned he could ask me for money more easily than he could offer me respect. I met Brian when I was already established in my own life. I was working in finance in Northern Virginia, building a serious career, and my parents had their own building supplies business, the kind built slowly, honestly, and without show. I grew up around people who watched every dollar, not because they were cheap, but because they understood what work actually cost. I never needed a man to rescue me, and I was never looking to marry for status. What pulled me toward Brian was the opposite of that. He seemed steady. He was not flashy, not especially smooth, not the kind of man who filled a room just to hear himself talk. He felt grounded. Safe. The kind of person who showed up. In the beginning, that mattered more to me than charm ever could. He looked you in the eye when he spoke. He listened. He carried himself like someone you could build an ordinary, decent life with, and at that point in my life, ordinary and decent sounded like a gift. The first time he took me to meet his mother Susan was warmth itself. She welcomed me into her home with that practiced softness some women wear so well, you mistake it for character. She fed me, asked thoughtful questions, and called me family before I had earned the right to doubt her. Looking back, I can see how completely I believed what I was being shown. That is the part people miss when they ask why a woman stays patient too long. She usually is not clinging to pain. She is clinging to the memory of when it all still looked real. Because it looked real for me, I let the next step happen when it came, and I never guessed that the kindness I thought I was stepping into would become the exact thing that trapped me later. The first year of my marriage to Brian was the calmest stretch we ever had. We lived in the Alexandria house without anyone else in it, and for a while, our life felt simple in a way that made me think I had chosen well. We both worked, came home tired, ate dinner together, talked about ordinary things, and moved through the same rooms without tension hanging over everything. Brian had his habits, I had mine, and at that stage those habits still felt like the small, familiar pieces of a real marriage. Then a little over a year in, Susan had a mild stroke. It was not the kind that left her severely disabled, but it was enough to slow her down, tire her out, and frighten Brian badly. I still remember the way he asked me to let her move in with us. We were in the kitchen that evening, and he told me he could not stand the thought of her being alone if something happened again. I said yes, because at the time saying no would have felt cruel. I was somebody's daughter too. I understood what fear for a parent could do to you. I helped set up the guest room for her, bought a more comfortable bed, moved things around so the house would be easier for her, and tried to make the place feel welcoming. In those first days, Susan acted genuinely grateful. She thanked me for meals, told me I was thoughtful, and spoke in that same soft voice I had trusted from the beginning. But that phase did not last long. Within a few weeks the questions started changing. She wanted to know what I made, whether my bonuses were good that year, how I handled savings, whose name was on what account, what I spent on clothes, gifts, and dinners out. None of it came all at once, and that was part of what made it hard to confront. Each question was small enough to brush off by itself. Together they started to feel like hands testing the edges of my life. I brought it up to Brian more than once, quietly at first. Every time he gave me some version of the same answer: she is older. She has been through a lot. Just be patient with her. What I did not understand then was that patience in that house was already being mistaken for permission. Over the next several years Susan stopped asking for things directly and got better at something much more effective. She learned how to float money into the room like a smell you could not ignore. It was always casual on the surface. She would mention how expensive medication had gotten, or how one of Brian's cousins was struggling with tuition, or how a decent family ought to help when somebody's roof started leaking. She never said, "Anna, give us money." She said everything around it until the silence itself became a demand. The first time the line was crossed in a way I could not explain away, I found it in my banking app. A transfer had gone out without Brian mentioning it to me. It was not the amount that hit me first. It was the fact that he had moved money like it belonged to both of them more than it belonged to me. When I asked him about it, he barely looked up. He said he had sent it to Susan because she wanted to put it somewhere that would grow. When I asked why he had not told me, he shrugged and told me it was not a big deal. Susan was even less subtle when I confronted her. She looked right at me and said money I earned was family money now. That was the phrase that changed the temperature in my body. After that the pattern widened and settled in. A wedding gift here, a repair there, help for a nephew. A contribution for school expenses. Something for a family celebration. Something for a household problem. Something for somebody on Susan's side who suddenly needed support. It all passed through the house with the same assumption underneath it. I would handle it. And the more I handled, the less visible I became. At family gatherings across Northern Virginia, Brian was placed beside the uncles, handed a drink, praised as the dependable son who was doing well for himself. I was pushed to the edge of the room with women who barely knew me or children who needed watching. If anyone asked what I did for work, Susan answered before I could. She called it office work. Paperwork. Numbers. Once she described me as basically a bookkeeper, even though I was a finance director handling decisions she would not have understood if I had laid them out in front of her. The insult was never loud enough to make a scene out of. That was what made it so effective. It stayed deniable. It stayed polished. It stayed just subtle enough that if I reacted, I would look like the problem. That was the pattern that formed our life. I paid like a central figure and was treated like an accessory. By the time Susan's next birthday came around, the money was not even the deepest wound anymore. It was what the money had taught them to assume about me. Last year was the first time I understood in a way I could not soften or explain away what my place in that family really was. Susan's birthday that year was smaller than the 60th, just a dinner at the house in Alexandria with close relatives, and I took care of nearly everything without being asked twice. I ordered the cake myself, picked out flowers. I knew she would like, planned the food, and spent the day moving between the kitchen and dining room, making sure everything looked right when people arrived. I was not doing it for praise. At least that is what I told myself then. I wanted peace. I wanted the evening to feel warm. I wanted them to see that I was trying. When dinner was underway, the house was full of that polished family noise that sounds cheerful from a distance and exhausting up close. People complimented the cake, the flowers, the spread, the way everything had come together. Then when it was time for Susan to speak, she stood there with her glass in her hand and thanked only Brian. She said everything good in her life was because of her son, that he took care of every detail, that she was lucky to have a son who loved her so well. More than one guest turned toward the table and praised the decorations again, and every single time Susan smiled and gave Brian the credit. He stood there and accepted it. He did not correct her once. I was less than a few feet away, still smelling like butter and oven heat, and I remember feeling myself go strangely still. After everyone finally left and the house quieted down, I told Susan as gently as I could that what she said had hurt me because I had done those things for her. She looked at me with total calm and said something that changed the shape of the whole marriage in my mind. She said that was a daughter-in-law's duty, and she did not understand why I would be hurt over doing what I was supposed to do. That was the moment I realized I was not being overlooked by accident. I was being defined. After that, I tried carefully and without drama to talk to Brian about setting limits around money and expectations. I still thought maybe if I spoke plainly enough, he would finally hear me. Instead, he turned it back on me and treated boundaries like cruelty. I walked away from that conversation holding on to one last thin hope that things might still change. That hope lasted right up until the night of Susan's 60th birthday, when they finally stopped hiding what they thought I was for. Back in that kitchen that same night with Brian's demand still ringing in my ear, I did not grab my purse and run to Alexandria to save them. I picked up my phone and called Olivia Bennett instead. Olivia was the private events manager at the venue, and she was also one of the only people in my life who would tell me the truth without trying to soften it into something easier to swallow. She answered on the second ring, and I asked her directly whether Susan Sullivan's 60th birthday was happening there that night. Olivia hesitated just long enough for me to know the answer before she gave it. Then she said yes. I asked the next question standing in the middle of my own kitchen, already knowing I was about to hear something that would change the rest of the night. Am I on the guest list? Olivia went quiet again, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped. No, Anna. You are not. Then she added the part that made my hand go cold around the phone. Susan had warned the staff that if I showed up, security was to stop me discreetly at the door and tell me there had been a misunderstanding. She had told them I was not comfortable around important people and might embarrass the family if I tried to come in. There are moments when humiliation is so precise it almost clears your head for you. That was one of them. Not forgotten. Not overlooked. Managed. Positioned. Put outside on purpose. I thanked Olivia and hung up. For 1 second, I just stood there in the silence with that truth sitting in the room beside me. Then the venue called me. That part should not have surprised me, but it still did. Earlier that week, Susan had insisted the event deposit be put on my card because, in her words, my credit limit would make everything simpler and we could settle the rest later. At the time, I had said yes, the way I had said yes to too many things in that family. So when the events office called, the booking was tied to my payment information and my authorization. The manager explained as carefully as he could that there was still a remaining balance of $3,500 they needed approved before full service could continue. I asked him whose card they had on file, and when he confirmed it was mine, I told him very calmly that I was not authorizing the remaining charge. I said I had not been invited to the event, I had no obligation to cover the unpaid balance, and he should follow venue policy exactly as written. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself twice. A few minutes later, Olivia called back. I could hear the strain in her voice before she even started talking. Susan had been standing to give a toast when the room was interrupted. Music stopped. The program paused. A manager stepped in and asked the family to settle the remaining balance before service continued. Olivia said Susan's face drained white in front of the room. Relatives started whispering. Someone made a comment loud enough for other tables to hear. Brian called me almost immediately after that, furious and panicked at once, asking what the hell I thought I was doing. Susan got on the phone after him, voice sharp with humiliation, demanding to know how I could let this happen to her in front of family. But for the first time in 8 years, I did not rush in to protect their image from the consequences of how they had treated me. I told them both the same thing in different words. They had wanted me to stay home, so I stayed home. Once I said it, there was no going back. By the time they left that venue and headed for Alexandria, I knew they were not coming home to apologize. They were coming home angry enough to finally say the quiet part out loud. A little after 10 that night, I heard the front gate slam and then the hard, uneven rush of footsteps coming up the path to the house. A second later, the front door flew open. And Brian and Susan came in, carrying the kind of silence people bring home when they have already exhausted their public anger and are saving the private part for the person they blame. Susan reached the kitchen first, still in her dress, face flushed from humiliation, and dropped her purse on the table hard enough to make the keys jump. Brian came in behind her with his tie loosened and his jaw locked. Neither of them asked a question because neither of them actually wanted an answer. Susan pointed at me and said I had humiliated her over just $3,500. Brian picked it up from there, saying the same thing in a different voice, as if repeating the number could make the night smaller than it was. I let them finish, then I said the one thing neither of them wanted the argument to be about. It was never just $3,500. It was respect. Susan laughed at that, not because it was funny but because she thought laughter could put me back in my place. She said I was a daughter-in-law and should start acting like one. Then she made the mistake that changed the whole room. She said this was Brian's house, that I lived there because of her son, and that I had no right to speak to either of them the way I was speaking. Brian, instead of stopping her, backed her up. There is something almost insulting about the confidence people have when they build authority on a lie. I walked to the drawer under the counter, pulled out the property file, and laid it on the table between them. When Susan saw me set it down, she frowned like I was trying a trick. Brian opened it first. I watched his face change before he said a word. Then Susan grabbed the papers and read the deed for herself. The house was titled in my name, Anna Walker, not Brian Sullivan's. I told them plainly that my side had funded the purchase, that Brian had signed mortgage paperwork as a co-borrower, but he was not the owner, and he never had been. For the first time that night, neither of them had anything ready to say. I did not throw them out. I did not need to. I told them that if they stayed in that house from that point forward, they would stay there under one condition only. They would speak to me with the respect they should have shown me years ago. I won that room, but even as I stood there, watching the shock settle over both of them, I knew people like Brian and Susan do not lose control and suddenly become reasonable. They go quiet first. Then they look for another way to strike. For the next 2 days, the house went unnaturally quiet. Susan stopped making little comments under her breath. Brian stopped trying to argue. He came home from work, ate without looking at me, and disappeared into the bedroom like he was waiting for instructions from someone smarter or meaner than he was. If I had been the version of myself they were used to, I might have taken that silence as progress. I might have thought the shock of that night had finally forced something into place. But by then I knew better. Silence like that is not peace when it comes after humiliation. It is planning. On the third evening, I came downstairs for water and heard Susan in the living room on the phone. I was not trying to listen, but the first sentence I caught stopped me cold. She said the house was in my name, so the only way to get it back was to ruin my reputation badly enough that I would panic and give in. I did not move. I stayed just out of sight in the hallway long enough to hear the rest, and while she kept talking, I pulled my phone from my pocket and started a voice memo. My hands were steady by then. That was the strange thing. I was past shock. I was listening like someone taking notes in a meeting. Susan spoke like a woman discussing strategy, not family. That was the moment I understood this had moved past resentment and into something dirtier. The next week, that understanding proved itself. I was at work in the Arlington corridor, barely settled at my desk when I was told senior leadership needed to see me right away. In the meeting were people from finance oversight, internal audit, and legal. They handed me an anonymous complaint alleging financial misconduct tied to one of my projects. It was detailed in a way that made my skin go cold. Whoever wrote it knew account patterns, old transfers, and just enough about my personal financial life to make the accusation sound credible on first read. It was not random. It was not office politics. It had the fingerprints of somebody who had lived close enough to watch, ask questions, and weaponize whatever they could gather. Sitting in that conference room, I realized Susan and Brian were no longer trying to punish me inside the house. They were trying to break the part of my life that gave me independence outside it. Once they crossed into my career, this stopped being a family fight I could manage with patience. It became something I would have to answer with proof. That night, after I got home from work and closed the door to my home office, I stopped thinking like a wounded wife and started thinking like the finance professional Susan and Brian had spent years pretending I was not. I pulled bank records, old statements, transfer histories, screenshots, and every message I could still access. Over the next few days I rebuilt the money trail piece by piece. Once I laid it out properly, the pattern was impossible to miss. The transfers that had always been framed as help for the household emergencies, family needs, or temporary support did not lead where I had been told they led. More than once the money had moved towards Susan's side of the family, not toward anything that had actually supported our life together. I saved everything, backed it up, and got legal guidance quietly so I would know exactly how to move without leaving room for denial later. Then I sent invitations for lunch that Sunday to the Sullivan relatives, whose opinions carried the most weight, framing it as a chance to clear the air before things got uglier. By the time everyone arrived at the house that afternoon, Brian looked tense, Susan looked insulted, and both of them still seemed to think this was another argument they could bully back into private. It stopped being private the moment I opened the file. I walked them through the transfers, the dates, the recipients, and the pattern. And then I played the recording of Susan in the living room saying the house was in my name and the only way to force it back was to destroy my reputation. The room changed the second her voice filled it. You know that feeling when a lie gets so exposed it cannot even hold its shape anymore. That was what it sounded like in my dining room. No one was looking at me the way they had looked at me before. They were looking at Susan like people who had finally seen the machinery behind the performance. I did not try to oversell what came next. I did not need to. I said plainly that this was no longer a family misunderstanding. It was a documented attempt to use my money, my house, and my career against me. Then I looked at Brian and told him I was filing for divorce. I gave him 7 days to leave the house voluntarily. Susan was leaving with him. If either of them tried to stall, argue or turn it into another drawn-out performance, the next step would be formal and legal. Susan opened her mouth like she still believed she could talk her way back into control, then stopped when she saw the room had already moved past her. Brian sat there like a man who had just discovered that passivity does not protect you forever if you spend years standing beside the wrong person. When it was over and the last relative had left, the house finally felt like mine in more than paperwork alone. The real victory was not watching them lose face. It was realizing I did not have to keep paying for my place in a family that had never treated me like I belonged. After everyone left, the quiet in that house felt different. So tell me this. If the people calling you family only remembered you when they needed your money, how long would you have stayed?